Hello, my name's Matthew Yee King, and I'm going to talk to you today about our research paper where we're examining student coding behaviours in creative computing lessons using abstract syntax trees and vocabulary analysis. Let's just see that title in its glory there. So yeah, it's quite a long title. We were just trying to really express what exactly we were doing in the paper, as one does with the title, and it ended up quite long. So sorry about that. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, I want to talk about the research questions. So I'm going to introduce 3 research questions which frame the work we're doing. It's quite exploratory work at this point, but you'll certainly get an idea what kind of exploration we're interested in from those research questions. We're going to talk about the context, so I'll mention creative computing and talk a little bit about what we do at our institutions regarding creative computing. I'll talk about the tools, so particularly our web-based coding platform Codecircle, and I'll hopefully do a live demo of that later. And we'll also talk about the data set, which involves or contains 16,000 student programs and instructor programs, which we've analysed in order to generate the data and analytics in this paper. I'll also talk about the metrics. So the metrics are essentially the features that we pulled out of our data set. And then I'll present those features sort of in summarized form in a few different visualizations and tables. Then finally, we'll revisit the research questions in the conclusion and see whether we've managed to answer them or progress them or explore them further. Okay, so what are the research questions? First of all, how can we characterize student coding behaviors? So I really want to know what students do when they're programming. I want to understand better how students go about programming in my lessons so that I can understand how I can improve those lessons to sort of encourage students to carry out certain types of behavior in their coding and to explore in certain ways. A little bit more about that in a minute. What do students do with our demonstrator code? So when we give students example code and example programs that they can work on to develop their own programs, how do they do that? What do they do, and what different types of demonstrator code do they prefer, or which ones get used the most and reused? Thirdly, how do coding behaviours vary in different contexts? So depending on the style of teaching, maybe the different instructor, different contexts like online or in a workshop and so on, how do coding behaviours vary between those different contexts? These are the things we're interested in, and as I say, they're very exploratory, so we're not really like finding the grand answer to all of these things. We're really exploring with this work at the moment. Okay, creative computing. Here's a quick summary of what we mean by creative computing. So it's really coming from that kind of STEAM style of teaching where we're taking engineering and mathematical techniques and really mixing in with that a kind of creative process. So Goldsmiths and the Creative Computing Institute are both places where there's a strong kind of creative arts disciplines going on, and we really want to engage with those kind of disciplines. And it's not just the fact that people are writing programs that generate graphics or programs that generate sound, it's also the way that they're doing it. So it's the focus of the teaching, and the fact is the focus of the teaching is on that kind of creative process. So we're very interested in developing people's process and encouraging them to explore and giving them the tools and abilities to get a problem space and explore it and find new problem spaces of their own that they're interested in and explore them. So that's really the philosophy behind it. It's kind of an art school inflected pedagogical approach. Okay, so about the tools, Codecircle and operational transformation. So let's start with Codecircle. So here's a screenshot of Codecircle, and I'm going to jump over to my other window where I'm going to start a quick demo. And so over here we have, so this is one of the programs which was actually in our data set that we analysed. And what you see here is the Codecircle user interface, which you can see there's a kind of code editor over here where I can go in and start editing my code. And then on the left here is my running program. So let's just have a little listen to what this program is, because you may have spotted the title there. So that should give you a bit of a clue that what we're talking about here is a drum machine. So you can kind of program it different patterns. Now there's a couple of features of this which are interesting, of this environment that are interesting. So it's a live coding environment. So let's say I want another track on my drum machine. I can just jump in there and maybe copy paste that array and stick another track in, and you'll see that I make a terrible error in my syntax because I'm in insert mode, and there we go. So now I've got my, shouldn't have done a live coding demo without thinking about what I was doing, should I? Anyway, so now I've got 3 tracks on my drum machine, and I can start playing with those. I haven't put another sound on it yet, but that's fine. Okay, so that just gives you a quick idea. It's a very rapid application development environment. And also, it's very quick to share things with students. So what you can do is you can, if your students are in a class, you can just quickly say, okay, right, I'm going to tag this one. So we add a tag, so class, call it class 1, for example. And then all the students who are in Codecircle can just quickly go class 1, and then straight away they can pull up your example, and they can then make their own copies of that. So they can pull down your example and do this thing, which is called forking, and that allows them to create their own copy of your program and work on that. So those are the key features, really, the fact that you can quickly live code and see the changes over in the program running window over there, and you can quickly fork and tag things. So we've really optimized and developed this to sort of help us in our particular way of teaching. So it's very much, it's not just like JS Fiddle, because we've designed this because we want to teach like that with a tool like this. Okay, I'll just now show you another quick example. Here's a sort of graphics example where you can see we've got a kind of geometric pattern, and again I can go in and start editing. So for example, if I want some more lines, I can do this and I get a more elaborate diagram straight away. So that's pretty cool. And there's a whole bunch of ready-made libraries that we've included in this. Some of them are other people's, like P5, and we've also got some of our own libraries, like our Rapid Mix project has some machine learning libraries, and we've got some audio libraries and things in there as well. Okay, so that's just a quick demo of the Codecircle platform. So I'm going to jump back to my slides now. And the thing about Codecircle is under the hood, it's collecting a whole bunch of data, and so this data looks like this. So underneath it has an operational transformation engine, and this enables students to collaboratively edit code, which I didn't show you there, but that's another feature. But in order to enable that feature, it's got a kind of Google Docs like operational transformation engine underneath it, based on the Share.js library. And what you can see on the screen here is an example of one operation that's been generated on Codecircle. So this operation is actually when someone creates a new document, and you can see down there we've got this kind of HTML code. So it's like showing you that it spews out that HTML code as the first step of creating a document, and then other information you can see that it's pegged as an edit. So that I in quotes there tells you this is an insert operation. So there are also delete operations. So if I delete some code, it will generate a delete operation. So it basically generates millions of these as students are coding. So every key press really and every copy paste operation will generate an operation, and it allows us to actually reconstruct the whole coding session step by step, so we can see how the program developed during its whole lifetime. And the other thing we can do, because remember I just showed you the fork feature, is actually we can build a fork tree. So let's say I share that drum machine demo in a lesson, and I tag it, and I get all my students to make a copy of it, and then they work on that for say 2 hours in the lesson. Then what I can do later is I can reconstruct a fork tree, which starts with my one. So say B was my drum machine at the top there, and then all the other ones are student copies of that, which they developed. And then what I can do then is I can track what people do on that fork tree. So what happened after my demonstrator program was shared with the students. So those are the key things, really: the operational transformation, the ability to reconstruct code, and then the ability to reconstruct the kind of history of the code as it gets developed over time. Okay, the data set. Yeah, as I say, the data set contains over 16,000 programs, 16,245, and these were gathered through all kinds of different contexts. So up the top there you can see there's a summer school that we run at Goldsmiths in the summer. Well, we're not running it this year because of COVID, but normally we bring students from around the world to come and do a creative computing summer school. So then below that you can see an empty lab. So that's our computing lab. So also it's from regular classroom teaching. People use the Codecircle platform. And then you've got two things here, which are the two MOOCs. So actually Codecircle has so far been used in two different massive open online courses. So the first one was a JavaScript and computer music course, which was taken by, I think, about 5,000 people in the end. And then the one below it is a sort of creative AV programming in JavaScript course, which was taken by another, I think, thousands of people again. So lots of people have used our Codecircle platform and sort of submitted data into this repository. So we just saw the first example, the drum machine, and then the second example, the geometric visualization, just to give you an idea of the variety of different programs on the platform. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the analysis. So we wanted to basically take that data which I've shown you and kind of extract some higher level features from it. So we have over time sort of developed a whole bunch of ideas around how we might represent what students are doing in our lessons, what kind of programming they're doing. And we sort of boiled that down and expressed it in terms of a bunch of metrics which we could extract from our code. So here are the metrics. I'm going to go through these. The details are obviously in the paper, but we're just going to give you an overview of what they're about. So there's forks by other users. Okay, so that's a simple metric of, okay, how many forks are made of our programs, and we do an averaging thing. So we say, well, we sort of average by the number of forks. So how many? It's more like repeated forks. So how many times do people come back and refork our code? That's kind of what we're talking about there. Then we've got code editing rate, which is literally ops per hour. So we just count the number of ops that they generate. So how many key presses, if you like, are they generating in over a given time period? And then you've got the total amount of editing. So in other words, the absolute amount of ops that were generated. Then we've got insert to delete ratio. So we found in a previous study that there's very interesting kind of associations between the amount of inserting of code and the amount of deleting of code. And we found that in certain types of lessons, people did a lot more kind of exploratory coding, where deleting and inserting and deleting and inserting. So that's the ratio between different types of operations they make on that code. Then you've got the syntax tree change rate. So this is the abstract syntax trees. So this is a more kind of semantic way of looking at the rate of change of the program. So raw operations per minute is one way of looking at it, but this is looking at how much the actual kind of semantic structure of the program, the functional structure of the program, changes over time. So we do that by reconstructing snapshots of the program and comparing subsequent snapshots to find out how much the AST has changed using the Gumtree algorithm. Then there's the abstract syntax tree total change amount. So over the whole lifetime of the program, how much did it change? Okay, then finally we've got the vocabulary metrics. So we've got vocabulary reuse and new vocabulary. So vocabulary reuse is when, so you look at the parent program, if you like, or the thing at the top of the fork tree, and then you see how many new function names they called in their program compared to the original. Okay, so we have to find out what was the sort of parent program or the deepest ancestor, most important ancestor, and we compare a program to that and say, well, how many new words, how many new functions did they come up with? So this gives us an idea of how much they're exploring a library, for example. Then we've got reuse, which is when let's say we called a function in the parent program, and then they in the ancestor program they pull out, they reuse that function, so it's got more instances of that function being called. Okay, so next we process the data. Sorry, this is the data bit. So we took the programs, we extracted those metrics I just mentioned for every document, put them in a big spreadsheet, and then we worked through the fork tree for a given document and then calculated, so from my document down into the fork tree from that document, what were the average metrics over the fork tree. And then that gave us 304 sort of master programs, if you like, which had 5 or more forks by people other than the original user. So because as instructors we tend to fork our own programs lots of times and refork them. So what we wanted to do, we want to look at other people forking our programs. So we came up with this simple way of filtering it down to a solid number of programs that have been reused a lot, and we came up with this idea of 5 5 non-original user forks. Okay, so that gave us 304 programs, but of course each of those we were analysing the whole fork tree of thousands and thousands of other programs. Okay, the results. So here's my first diagram of the results. And what we did is we took those 304 programs and we looked at we pulled out the metrics over the fork trees for each of those programs, and then we did a principal component analysis and plotted it on a 2D graph with the clustering. And you can see that this doesn't look visually that particularly strong, but the crosses show you. So you can see there's a little cross kind of up there, and they show you the cluster centers. And we selected a k equals 4. We used k means to do this clustering, and we chose a k equals 4 because that gave the best combination of distancing between the clusters and integrity of the clusters. Again, details in the paper, but that was our optimal kind of number of clusters, 4. And so yeah, but what's going on in the clusters? Well, this diagram shows you a bit more detail about what's going on in the clusters. So what you can see here is the code edit rate, for example, the forks by others, and the insert delete ratio. So each of these kind of weird polygon shapes represents one cluster. So for example, the green stuff is one cluster, and it basically tells you what the variation is between those metrics in the different clusters. So you can see that the green cluster, for example, had lots of vocabulary reuse. It had lots of AST total distance change. Lots of edit rates, lots of code edits as well. So that one tells you that particular cluster, loads of good stuff was happening, if you like. If your objective in your lesson is to see lots of reuse of vocab, lots of change of the program from the demonstrator starter code and so on, then that green cluster looks like quite a desirable pattern of behaviour. But other instructors would have a different desirable pattern of behaviour. They might want students to make loads and loads of forks, in which case, you can see that the blue one there has lots of forks, and so on. So what we can do, look at these clusters, and we can kind of characterize what was going on in those clusters. And this table here shows the key sort of elements that allow us to differentiate between the clusters. So each column represents a cluster. So if we go down a column, we can see, say, cluster 1 has lots of forks by others, has lots of code editing in total, and lots of AST edit total, and so on and so forth. So it allows you can see that, and there's significantly different patterns of those metrics going on in each cluster. So we definitely identified groups of behavior or patterns of behavior in our data set. Okay, so if I was to sort of just summarize that, I could say that cluster 1 had lots of short root programs, which were mostly written by the same instructor, and there were lots of forks, lots of AST change. That was the green one that we saw in the previous diagram. Then cluster 3 was similar to 1, but a slightly different pattern, and it had a different instructor. And cluster 4, lots of non-instructor code, so lots of students' code that was being reused by other students in this cluster. And then cluster 2 was a really large cluster that sort of had bits of everything in it. So I guess you could say that 1, 3 and 4 were kind of clearly distinct clusters, and then 2 was like the grab bag that everything else went into. So yeah. Okay, conclusion. So let's bring up those research questions again. So how can we characterize student coding behavior? Well, what we've shown here with our sort of engineering of these metrics is that we've come up with a sensible set of metrics which we think can represent what students are doing in our lessons, and we find them useful to sort of explain different patterns of behaviour in lessons. So did the students make loads of functional change to a program? Did the students just do loads and loads of editing? What was the quality of the editing? Were they inserting? Were they deleting code? Were they reusing vocabulary or going out and finding new vocabulary in the API? So that's how we're characterising coding behaviour. What do students do with our demonstrator code? So we can say that, we can look at the pattern of forking. We can say, well, in this lesson, the demonstrator code was heavily forked and reused later, and was proved to be really useful for doing lots of different projects, for example. By looking at that fork tree and looking at the metrics over there, we can really track what happens with different demonstrator programs. How do coding behaviours vary in different contexts? So we found that, we found a couple of clusters that really differentiated between instructors, and we had another cluster which kind of seemed to be based around lots of students forking each other's code, and actually the two instructors had quite distinctly different patterns as well. So depending on the teaching style, the instructor, and what they were trying to achieve, you'd clearly see very different patterns of behaviour. Okay, so that's the end. And I just said at the beginning I was going to give a plug to the Mimic project. So the Mimic platform is our next gen platform, and I'm just going to jump over to that now and show you that. So Mimic, this is the website. It's got a whole bunch of different stuff. So if you go into the guides, you can see we've got guides covering interactive machine learning, writing music programs in the browser in different ways, including evolutionary audio, which is one of my research topics of interest, music and analysis, extracting features from audio, and all kinds of stuff. So there's loads of getting started stuff in there, and there's also a whole library of projects that other people have created, so you can browse through and dig around and see what other people are up to, what's popular, and so on. Okay, so that's just my little plug for the Mimic project there. So at this point, I'll say thank you very much for listening. So I'm Matthew Yi King. I'm based at Goldsmiths, but other partners on the project are based at the Creative Computing Institute at the University of the Arts London. And obviously the Mimic project is a collaboration between lots of different institutions funded by the AHRC. But we've also previously received funding from HEFKey and even the EU for various bits of this project and ideas that we've developed over time. So thanks very much for listening and watching.